Silas screamed as his golden aura flickered and died like a cheap light bulb. The grand stage of the St. Sophia Cathedral felt like a funeral pyre as his muscles shriveled in real time. He collapsed to his knees, his tuxedo tearing at the seams as his fraudulent power evaporated. "You were supposed to keep me standing," Silas hissed, his eyes darting toward the shadows where Evelyn stood. The crowd of elite socialites gasped, their cameras capturing every second of the war god's pathetic meltdown. This was the man they had worshipped, now reduced to a trembling coward on the cold marble floor. Evelyn watched from the corner, her hands gripping the heavy iron chains that bound her wrists. For 3 years, her blood had fueled his victories, but today she had finally severed the cord. Just 10 minutes ago, Silas had been at his peak, his hand wrapped tightly around the throat of a rival while the crowd cheered. He had looked at Evelyn with pure disgust, calling her a broken cur and a parasite. "You are nothing but a battery for my greatness," he had whispered into her ear, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and unearned arrogance. He had forced her to kneel in the dirt while he accepted medals for battles she had won for him. The high priest stepped forward, his eyes cold as he looked down at the shivering fraud. The divine light of the cathedral did not shine on Silas. It avoided him like he was a plague. The silence was broken by the heavy thud of combat boots echoing against the stone. A man wearing a jagged iron mask emerged from the mist, his presence so suffocating that the air itself seemed to thin. Caleb, the exiled alpha, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His shadow stretched across the hall, swallowing Silas whole. The scent of burnt cedar and predatory hunger filled the room, making every woman in the room tremble with a mixture of fear and undeniable lust. Caleb walked straight past the trembling Silas as if he were a piece of discarded trash. He stopped in front of Evelyn. The iron mask glinted in the dim light, hiding the face of a king everyone thought was dead. His gloved hand reached out, catching the heavy chains that held Evelyn's fragile wrists. With a single, effortless jerk, the reinforced steel snapped like dry twigs. The sound of the breaking metal was louder than Silas's whimpering. Caleb stepped into Evelyn's personal space, his chest nearly brushing her shoulders. He wrapped a massive arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard, armored body. The heat from his skin burned through her thin rags. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, as he let out a low, possessive growl. "You are done serving cowards," he murmured, his voice a vibration that rattled her bones. The socialites who had spent the evening mocking Evelyn now turned pale with envy. They watched as the most dangerous man in the werewolf kingdom claimed a woman they had called a cripple just moments before. The high priest dropped to one knee, his forehead touching the floor. "The rightful king has returned," the old man's voice trembled with terror and awe. Silas tried to stand, his face twisted in a mask of desperation. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking like a child's. "I am the hero of the border wars. I am the one you need." But as he spoke, his skin began to gray and wrinkle. Without Evelyn's holy blood to mask the rot, his body was finally showing the price of his stolen power. He looked like a dying old man in a suit that cost more than his life was worth. Caleb didn't even look back at him. He kept his eyes locked on Evelyn, his thumb tracing the bruises Silas had left on her neck. Every touch from Caleb felt like a searing balm, a silent promise of the carnage to come. The envy in the room reached a fever pitch as Caleb took off his heavy fur cloak and draped it over Evelyn's shivering frame, marking her as his. Silas reached out, trying to grab the hem of Caleb's cloak, but an invisible wall of pressure slammed him back into the floor. "You think you can just take her?" Silas barked, a desperate laugh escaping his throat. "She belongs to the military. She is state property." The high priest looked up, his eyes flashing with a holy fire. "She is the sacred blood, you pathetic thief, and you are nothing but a corpse we haven't buried yet." The priest held up a golden scroll, the seal of the Wolf King already glowing red. The judgment was already signed. Silas watched in horror as his name vanished from the parchment, erased as if he had never existed. Evelyn felt Caleb's hand tighten on her hip, his grip aggressive and unyielding. She could smell the metallic tang of his mask and the wild, untamed forest on his skin. It was the scent of a predator who had come home to claim his mate and slaughter his enemies. She leaned her head back against his chest, watching Silas crawl toward the feet of the guests guests he had tried to impress. Nobody moved to help him. The Manguerain who had been flirting with him just an hour ago now stepped back, pulling their silk dresses away to avoid being touched by his filth. He was a social ghost, a dead man walking in a room full of people who had already forgotten his name. Caleb leaned closer to Evelyn, his iron mask cold against her cheek. "Watch closely," he whispered. "This is only the beginning of his erasure." Silas scrambled to his feet, his fingers clawing at the metals pinned to his chest as if they could still grant him power. "Security! Where is the Iron Legion? Arrest this masked pretender!" he shrieked, his voice cracking like dry glass. He pointed a trembling finger at Caleb, looking at the elite guards stationed around the hall. They were the men Silas had led for years, the brutal enforcers of his will. But as the guards moved, they didn't draw their weapons on Caleb. They turned their backs to him, forming a wall of steel that boxed Silas in. The sound of 300 synchronized heartbeats filled the silent cathedral, a rhythmic thud that sounded like a war drum. It was the sound of true loyalty, and it didn't belong to Silas. A general stepped out from the ranks, a man Silas had called his right hand. The veteran didn't even glance at his former commander. Instead, he knelt before Caleb, his forehead touching the cold floor. "We have waited 5 years for your return, Your Majesty." The general's voice was a gravelly roar that shook the chandeliers. Evelyn felt Silas's world shattering. She could practically smell the sour metallic tang of his panic, sharp against the heavy masculine scent of Caleb's leather armor. Silas tried to lunge for her, his face a mask of primal desperation. "You did this, you traitorous bitch! Heal me now, or I'll strip the skin from your back." He didn't get within 3 feet. Caleb's hand moved faster than a strike of lightning, his fingers locking around Silas's wrist with a sickening crunch. The sound of snapping bone was muffled by Silas's own choking gasp as Caleb twisted the limb like a piece of wet paper. Caleb didn't even use his full strength. He treated Silas like a bothersome insect. He pulled Evelyn closer, his palm flat against the small of her back, pushing her body into the curve of his. The aggressive heat of him was a shield against the cold malice of the room. He leaned down, his iron mask cold against Evelyn's temple. "Does he still think he owns the air you breathe?" Caleb's voice was a dark, dangerous velvet. Silas fell back, clutching his shattered wrist, his eyes bulging as he watched his soldiers, his supposed legacy, remain motionless as he suffered. He realized then that every battle he had won, every promotion he had received, had been recorded by men who knew the truth. They had watched him bleed Evelyn dry to stay standing, and they had loathed him for it. "You were never a wolf," Caleb said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "You were a parasite wearing a hero's skin. And parasites are removed." One by one, the high priest began to strip the honors from the altar. The Golden Cross of Valor, the Star of the Northern Front, all of them were tossed into a heap at Silas's feet like common scrap metal. "These belong to the sacred blood, who kept our armies alive, not the coward who hid behind her," the priest declared. The socialites who had laughed at Evelyn's chains now looked at the pile of gold with horror. They realized the metals Silas had used to woo them were stained with the blood of the woman they had just mocked. Evelyn felt the weight of Caleb's cloak on her shoulders, heavy and smelling of deep winter forests and ancient power. It was a physical mark of her new status. The envy in the room was a tangible force, a wave of heat from the women who realized that the disabled girl was now the most powerful person in the kingdom. Caleb's fingers brushed the underside of her jaw, forcing her to look up at the iron slits of his mask. "Tell them, Evelyn," he whispered. "Tell them what he begged for every night in the trenches." The silence was absolute. Evelyn looked at Silas, who was now shivering so violently his teeth were chattering. She remembered the nights he had knelt by her cage, weeping and pleading for just one drop of her blood to heal his coward's wounds. He had promised her the world in the dark, only to spit on her in the light. "He begged for mercy he never gave," Evelyn said, her voice clear and cold. "He begged to be more than the nothing he is." Silas let out a hysterical laugh, a broken, jagged sound. "I made you. I gave you a place in this world. Without me, you'd be a corpse in a ditch." He looked around the room. searching for a single friendly face, but he found only a void of indifference. His allies, the men who had shared his stolen wine and women, were already looking away, erasing him from their memories to protect their own skin. Caleb stepped forward, his boots crushing Silas's most prized metal into the marble. The sound of metal grinding against stone was the final nail in the coffin. You didn't make her, Silas. You broke yourself trying to contain her. Caleb reached down and grabbed Silas by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, lifting the man off the floor with one hand. The contrast between Silas's frantic kicking and Caleb's immovable strength was a public execution of Silas's dignity. The high priest raised a blackened iron seal. By the authority of the first blood, Silas of the house of Vane is hereby stripped of his name, his lands, and his right to walk among the living. He is a ghost. He is the silence between words. Silas tried to scream, but no sound came out. The ritual of erasure was already taking hold, a spiritual weight that seemed to suck the very color from his skin. He was becoming a shadow in a room full of light. Caleb tossed the man toward the heavy oak doors of the cathedral like a bag of refuse. The guards didn't catch him. They stepped aside, letting Silas hit the stone stairs and tumble down into the dark, rainy night outside. The doors slammed shut, the heavy boom echoing like a gavel. The envy in the room shifted into a desperate, crawling sycophancy. The guests began to bow, their voices a hushed murmur of "Long live the king and bless the sacred blood." Caleb ignored them all. He turned his full attention back to Evelyn, his hand moving from her waist to her neck, his thumb tracing the pulse that hammered under her skin. "You are finally alone with me," he murmured, his presence an overwhelming storm. Silas crawled through the freezing mud, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He reached into his ruined tuxedo, pulling out a titanium encrypted phone. He needed his lawyers. He needed his offshore accounts. He needed the millions he had stashed away from the military contracts Evelyn had helped him secure. But the screen remained black, a cold slab of glass that refused to recognize his biometric scan. Access denied. User does not exist. The mechanical voice was a death knell in the pouring rain. Inside the cathedral, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume turned sour with fear. Evelyn felt the heavy weight of Caleb's hand on her shoulder, his fingers digging slightly into her skin through the thick fur of his cloak. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was an anchor, a claim that made her blood hum with a power she hadn't felt in years. "You are shaking," Caleb murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly at her heart. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled her flush against his side, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone with predatory focus. Outside, Silas screamed at a passing black sedan, recognizing the crest of the house of Vane on the door. "Stop! It's me, your lord," he bellowed, throwing himself in front of the vehicle. The car didn't slow down. It splashed him with gutter water, the driver looking through him as if he were nothing more than a shadow in the mist. His own father sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead, his eyes vacant and glassed over. The Vane family had not just abandoned him, they had been lobotomized of his very existence. The high priest stood over the golden scroll, his hands glowing with a faint, ghostly light. "The asset liquidation is complete," he announced to the room. "The estates, the armories, the blood rights of the Vane lineage, all have been transferred to the crown's chosen consort." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes full of a terrifying reverence. The socialites shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Evelyn's ragged dress and the priceless fur cloak draped over her shoulders. The envy was a physical heat, a shimmering envy that made the air tremble. Silas found his way to the back entrance of his private club, the place where he had spent thousands on bottles of champagne while Evelyn starved in her cell. The doorman, a man Silas had tipped with gold just last week, put a hand on his chest. "Deliveries are in the alley." "Beggar," the man said, his voice devoid of any recognition. Silas tried to punch him, but his muscles were like water. Without Evelyn's holy blood, his body was failing, the years of combat stress catching up to him in a single, agonizing wave. He collapsed against the brick wall, weeping into the filth. Caleb leaned down, his iron mask inches from Evelyn's face. She could smell the cold metal and the intoxicating scent of ancient pine needles on him. "Do you want to see him one last time?" he asked. His hand moved to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, forcing her to meet the dark slits of his eyes, not for mercy, but to see what happens to things that try to steal what belongs to me. The aggression in his tone was a drug, a sweet, dark promise that made her knees weak. I want to see him realize it was never his, Evelyn whispered, her voice finally finding its edge. Caleb's grip tightened for a fraction of a second, a silent approval that sent a shiver of heat through her body. He turned her around, his arm draped over her shoulders like a living shield, and led her toward the massive oak doors. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, their heads bowed in a mixture of terror and desperate desire to be noticed by the new king. They stepped out into the rain, but the water didn't touch them. A shimmer of Caleb's aura formed a dry canopy over their heads. They found Silas huddled near a trash heap, clutching a discarded newspaper to stay warm. He looked up, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Evelyn, you have to tell them. Tell them who I am," he begged, reaching out a muddy hand toward her pristine cloak. Caleb didn't even move a muscle. He simply stood there, his presence so massive that Silas seemed to shrink into the dirt. "You are the ghost of a thief, Silas," Evelyn said, looking down at the man who had once been her son and her shadow. "You traded my life for metals that are now scrap. You traded my soul for a name that no longer exists." She reached into the pocket of Caleb's cloak and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal, the first badge Silas had ever won. She dropped it into the mud in front of him. "Consider this your final payment for the blood you stole." Silas stared at the badge, a hysterical, broken laugh bubbling up from his throat. "I was a god. I was the war god," he screamed at the sky, but the thunder drowned him out. He tried to grab the badge, but his fingers were too weak to pick it up. He was a broken machine, a tool that had been used until it snapped and was now being discarded in the alley where it belonged. The identity void was complete. He didn't even know his own middle name anymore. Caleb pulled Evelyn away, his hand sliding down to grip her waist with possessive force. He didn't look back at the wretch in the mud. He had already forgotten Silas existed. "My plane is waiting," he said, his voice dropping to a private, dangerous whisper. "There is a throne in the north that has been cold for too long, and a bed that has been empty." The sexual tension in the air was a thunderstorm of its own, heavy and electric. Evelyn leaned into him, her heart thumping against his armored chest, as the black sedan pulled up to whisk them away from the wreckage of Silas's life. Silas pulled himself out of the mud, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the dark embassy. It was the neutral ground of the vampire clans, the sworn enemies of the Wolf Kingdom. He needed to sell what he knew. His memory was a library of secret routes, supply chain vulnerabilities, and the precise frequency of the Northern Alpha's defense grid. He had memorized them all while Evelyn had worked in the next room, assuming she was too broken to understand the complexity of war. "I still have value," he whispered to the rain, a manic, desperate hope sparking in his dead eyes. "I can buy a new life with their deaths." Inside the black sedan, the air was a suffocating cocktail of expensive leather and the intoxicating primal scent of Caleb's aura. He had pulled Evelyn onto his lap, his massive arms wrapping around her like an unyielding cage. He didn't speak. His silence was a heavier weight than any words. He used his thumb to trace the pulse that hammered under her jaw, his touch possessive and rough. He was assessing his property, making sure no part of her still resonated with the memory of Silas's touch. The aggressive view from the socialites left behind was replaced by a wave of pure terror within the car's confined space. She was alone with the king. Silas banged on the massive iron doors of the embassy, screaming for asylum. When the pale, elegant guards opened the gate, he threw himself at their feet. "I have the keys to the Wolf Kingdom," he shouted, saliva dripping from his chin. "I can give you the northern front in exchange for sanctuary." He didn't see the tiny red laser dot centered on his forehead, a signal that his every word was being monitored by the very king he was trying to betray. He was already dead. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Caleb's phone buzzed once. A single text. Trajectory confirmed. Traitor engaging with enemy. He didn't look at the screen. He leaned down, his iron mask pressing cold against Evelyn's temple. "You didn't just heal his wounds, did you?" he murmured, his voice a vibration that rattled her bones. "You designed his victories. Every route he thinks is a secret, every weakness he thinks he found. They are your architecture. The sex tension was a physical pressure in the car, a thunderstorm waiting to break. He was praising her genius, but his praise felt like a threat of total possession. Inside the embassy, a high-ranking vampire lord listened to Silas's frantic offer. The lord's eyes were ancient and cold as Silas outlined the secret weak point in the northern grid. "We will verify this," the Lord said, his voice a dusty whisper. But even as he spoke, a hidden screen behind Silas flashed with a real-time update from the northern front. The defense grid was already changing, shifting its frequency in perfect synchronicity with Evelyn's heartbeat, which Caleb was monitoring. The information Silas had was already outdated, a legacy of a system that no longer existed. Silas watched the vampire lord's expression shift from curiosity to homicidal rage. A cold dread washed over him. He realized then that Evelyn had never just been a passive battery. She had been the system itself. Every battle plan she had helped him with was a carefully designed kill box. Every secret she had allowed him to overhear was a time bomb waiting to explode on the day of his betrayal. The identity void slammed into him again, but this time it was an infinite abyss. He wasn't just nothing, he was a weapon designed to kill himself. Caleb's hand slid from Evelyn's waist to her throat, not to choke her, but to hold her still. "Tell them," he commanded, his iron mask millimeters from her lips. "What is the final command you pre-programmed into his memory?" The silence was absolute. He was forcing her to voice her own cruelty, to own the annihilation she had created. Evelyn met his dark gaze. "Erase," she whispered. Caleb let out a low, predatory laugh that made her skin crawl with a terrifying mix of fear and lust. He kissed her then, a hard, punishing claim that tasted of blood and ancient power, blocking out the world. Inside the embassy, the vampire lord stood up. "You offer us a map of a ghost town, thief, and you offer us the smell of a wolf. For your incompetence and your cowardice, there is only one penalty." Silas screamed as the guards lunged for him. He was a low-class fraud who had tried to play the masters, only to realize he was the punchline of a joke written 3 years ago. The mirror karma was complete. He had built a career on stolen information, and now he was being executed for offering information that was stolen from him. Silas sat in the damp, lightless pit of the vampire dungeon. The Lord hadn't killed him yet. They wanted to savor the spectacle of a fallen god. A single tablet was tossed through the iron bars, its screen flickering to life in the gloom. It was a digital archive of the last 3 years. Silas crawled toward it, his broken fingers trembling as he scrolled through the files. Project: The War Gods Rise. Architect: Evelyn. 2023: The Battle of the Red Gorge. Winner: Silas. Truth: Evelyn leaked the enemy's flank positions through an anonymous encrypted channel. 2024: The Siege of Voros. Winner: Silas. Truth: Evelyn jammed the enemy's communications grid 10 minutes before his arrival. Every medal, every promotion, every standing ovation he had ever received was documented here as a task completed by the woman he had kept in a cage. He hadn't been a lion leading wolves. He had been a puppet on a string, dancing to a tune he was too stupid to hear. Silas let out a jagged, dry sob that sounded more like a rattle. He had spent his life mocking her weakness, never realizing his entire existence was a charity project she had built only to burn. He looked at the screen until his eyes burned, waiting for a final word, a taunt, a goodbye. But there was nothing. The file simply ended. He wasn't even worth a final insult. The silent realization hit him like a physical blow. He had never truly existed. He was a hallucination of greatness that had finally vanished. High above the clouds, the private jet cut through the night like a silver blade. The cabin was silent, save for the low hum of the engines. Caleb had removed his iron mask, tossing it onto the velvet seat like a piece of discarded trash. His face was a landscape of scars and cold, lethal beauty. He sat with his legs spread, his gaze fixed on Evelyn as she sat across from him, wrapped in his fur cloak. The scent of Caleb's sweat, expensive tobacco, and the ozone of the high altitude filled her senses. He reached out, his hand wrapping around her throat in a possessive, unyielding grip. He didn't squeeze, but the threat of his strength was a constant electric pressure. "You did well," he murmured, his voice a dark rasp that made her skin hum. "But the architecture ends here. You will not build any more kings." He pulled her toward him, forcing her to kneel between his legs. His thumb traced the curve of her bottom lip, his touch aggressive and hungry. "From this moment on, you only breathe for the north. You only heal the wounds I allow you to see." His shadow swallowed her whole, a massive, predatory weight that offered no escape and no mercy. The envy of the world below was a million miles away. There were no cameras here, no socialites, no meddling priests. There was only the king and the blood. Evelyn leaned her forehead against his knee, the rough fabric of his combat trousers scratching her skin. She didn't ask for a future. She didn't ask for a life. She simply felt the heat of his palm as it moved from her neck to the back of her head, locking her into place. Caleb leaned down, his lips brushing her ear as the plane began its descent into the frozen mountains of the north. "The world thinks you are a saint," he whispered, his teeth grazing her skin, "but I know you are the monster that destroyed a god, and I am the only cage strong enough to hold you." The lights of the cabin dimmed as the jet touched the snowy runway. The doors opened to a wall of freezing wind and 1,000 soldiers standing in perfect, terrifying silence. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout. They simply knelt as Caleb stepped out into the cold, carrying Evelyn against his chest like a stolen prize. The story of Silas was over. The reign of the king had begun.
Watching Silas realize that his entire war god legacy was just a charity project Evelyn built so she could burn it down is the ultimate psychological execution. Honestly, seeing him rot in that dungeon with nothing but the truth is far more satisfying than a quick ending. If you found out your biggest rival was actually the secret architect behind every success you ever had, would you stay quiet to keep the glory? Or would your ego let it all collapse? I actually debated giving Silas a more violent exit, but I realized leaving him alive to witness his own irrelevance was the real mastermind move.